Who invited the janitor? The question sliced through the elegant ballroom just seconds after Jerome Carter stepped through the doors, and the laughter that followed rolled across the room like a wave. Beneath towering crystal chandeliers, surrounded by white roses and gold-trimmed decorations that seemed to glow beneath the warm evening lights, Jerome paused for only a moment. He adjusted the cuff of his old black suit, smoothed a wrinkle from his sleeve, and continued walking as though he hadn't heard a thing. Around him, guests exchanged amused glances. Most of them wore custom-tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. Diamond bracelets flashed beneath the lights. Expensive watches peeked from beneath crisp shirt cuffs. They belonged to a world of private clubs, luxury vacations, and business deals discussed over $1,000 dinners. Jerome belonged to none of it. At least, that's what they assumed. At 62 years old, Jerome looked ordinary. His suit was clean but clearly old. His shoes had been polished carefully, yet years of wear still showed along the edges. In his hand, he carried a weathered manila envelope that seemed strangely out of place among the luxury surrounding him. A young man near the champagne fountain smirked. Maybe he's delivering a package. A few people chuckled. Jerome kept moving. His eyes never wandered toward the crowd. Instead, they remained fixed on the wedding altar at the far end of the ballroom. There, beneath an arch covered in white flowers, stood Daniel Brooks, the groom. Daniel was speaking with family members, smiling for photographs, completely unaware that the atmosphere inside the room was beginning to shift. Jerome watched him quietly. There was pride in his eyes. Pride and something else. Something heavier. Something that looked almost like memory. Near the front of the ballroom, Charles Whitmore, father of the bride, noticed the unfamiliar guest. His expression tightened immediately. Charles had spent nearly a year planning this wedding. Every detail had been controlled. Every guest had been personally approved. He knew the names of senators, CEOs, investors, and community leaders sitting at those tables. But he had never seen Jerome Carter before. Who was that man? Charles asked one of the event coordinators. The woman glanced toward Jerome and shook her head. I'm not sure, sir. Charles frowned. That answer wasn't acceptable. Not tonight. His gaze settled on the worn envelope in Jerome's hand. Suspicion immediately crept into his thoughts. Before long, whispers began spreading from table to table. Some guests assumed Jerome had come looking for charity. Others guessed he had mistaken the venue for another event. The rumors grew with every passing minute. Yet Jerome remained calm. He reached a quiet corner near the back of the ballroom and sat alone beside a large window overlooking the evening gardens. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. Inside, the celebration continued without him. Jerome carefully placed the envelope on his lap. His fingers rested against its worn edges. For a moment, his eyes closed. Then he opened the flap slightly and looked inside. Hidden within was an old photograph. The second he saw it, a faint smile touched his face. And across the room, Daniel Brooks suddenly turned his head as if he had felt something change. Daniel Brooks could not explain why he suddenly looked across the ballroom. One moment he was smiling for photographs beside Emily, thanking relatives and greeting old friends, and the next he felt an odd pull in his chest. His eyes moved past the flower arrangements, past the crowded tables, and settled on the elderly man sitting quietly by the window. The conversation around him faded. The music seemed distant. Daniel narrowed his eyes. There was something familiar about the way the man sat. Something about the calm posture, the straight back, the steady hands resting on that worn envelope. Across the room, Jerome remained unaware of the attention. He was looking down at the old photograph again. The edges had faded over the years, but the memory inside it remained as clear as ever. A younger Daniel stood beside several other soldiers beneath a bright desert sky. Everyone in the picture was smiling. Everyone believed life would remain that simple forever. Jerome slowly ran a thumb across the corner of the photograph before sliding it back into the envelope. Nearby, two guests watched him with curiosity. Has anyone figured out who he is? One woman whispered. Her companion shook his head. No idea, but Charles looks ready to throw him out. Their eyes drifted toward the bride's father. Charles Whitmore stood near the front of the room, speaking with several business associates, though his attention repeatedly returned to Jerome. The sight of the unfamiliar guest seemed to bother him more with every passing minute. Finally, he excused himself and crossed the ballroom floor. Conversations softened as people noticed where he was heading. Charles stopped beside Jerome's table. The older man immediately rose to his feet out of respect. "Good evening," Jerome said politely. Charles forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "I am afraid we have not met." "No, sir," Jerome replied. "I do not believe we have." Charles glanced toward the envelope. "Are you a friend of the family?" Jerome hesitated for a moment. "You could say that." The answer only deepened Charles's suspicion. "Which side?" Jerome looked toward Daniel. A faint smile appeared. "The Grooms." Charles followed his gaze and frowned. He knew nearly every person Daniel had invited. This man was not on any list he remembered. Around them, guests pretended not to watch while secretly following every word. The tension grew quietly beneath the elegant atmosphere of the celebration. Jerome sensed it but refused to react. He had spent too many years learning patience. Charles folded his arms. "And how exactly do you know Daniel?" Before Jerome could answer, applause erupted near the altar as the wedding coordinator announced the next part of the ceremony. The interruption saved him from responding. Charles looked irritated. Jerome looked relieved. But as Charles turned away, his eyes landed briefly on the edge of the photograph still visible inside the envelope. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Because the young man standing beside Daniel in that picture looked remarkably familiar. Charles Whitmore could not shake the feeling that he had seen that photograph before. As he walked away from Jerome's table, he glanced back twice, his polished dress shoes clicking softly across the marble floor. The celebration continued around him. Glasses clinked. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Guests laughed beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet Charles found himself distracted by a man he could not place. He approached Rebecca Hayes, the wedding planner overseeing the evening. "I need you to check something for me," he said quietly. Rebecca followed his gaze toward the back of the ballroom. "The gentleman by the window?" Charles nodded. "Find out who invited him." Rebecca hesitated. "Sir, perhaps he is a friend of Daniel's." Charles's jaw tightened. "Then it should be easy to confirm." Moments later, Rebecca crossed the ballroom. Jerome noticed her approaching and stood politely. "Mr. Carter?" she asked with a professional smile. Jerome nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was wondering if I could help you find your assigned table." Jerome looked around the room before answering. "I do not believe I have one." Rebecca blinked. "You do not." Jerome offered a gentle smile. "I was invited, but I never received a seating card." The answer only deepened the mystery. Around nearby tables, guests quietly listened while pretending to focus on their conversations. A few exchanged knowing looks. Others began drawing their own conclusions. Rebecca maintained her composure. "May I ask who invited you?" Jerome glanced once more toward Daniel. Daniel Brooks did. Rebecca followed his eyes. The groom was speaking with several relatives near the dance floor. "Personally?" she asked. "Yes," Jerome replied. "Personally." Rebecca thanked him and walked away, but uncertainty lingered on her face. When she returned to Charles, she repeated every word. Charles folded his arms. "That does not make sense." Across the ballroom, whispers began spreading again. Some guests now believed Jerome was exaggerating. Others assumed he had somehow mistaken a casual interaction for a formal invitation. The more people speculated, the larger the story became. Yet through it all, Jerome remained completely calm. He sat quietly beside the window, watching the fading sunlight. Beyond the gardens, golden rays stretched across the lawn outside, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed hedges. There was a peace about him that seemed untouched by the gossip surrounding him. Meanwhile, Daniel continued greeting guests, unaware of the growing tension. But every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the back of the room. Something about the elderly man felt strangely familiar, a feeling he could not explain. Then Emily noticed. "You keep looking over there," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "Do I?" Emily followed his gaze and spotted Jerome sitting alone. "Do you know him?" Daniel looked carefully across the room. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his expression changed slightly. Not recognition. Not yet. Just curiosity mixed with something deeper. "I am not sure," he admitted. At that exact moment, a server passed Jerome's table. The envelope shifted slightly and slid open. Part of the photograph became visible again beneath the ballroom lights. And from where he stood nearly 50 feet away, Daniel suddenly froze. Daniel stared across the ballroom. unable to pull his eyes away from the photograph partially exposed inside Jerome's envelope. The image was small from this distance, and yet something about it struck him with unsettling force. It was not the picture itself. It was the feeling it awakened. A memory buried somewhere deep beneath years of routine, success, and ordinary life. The laughter around him faded into background noise. Emily noticed immediately. "Daniel?" she asked softly. He blinked and looked at her. "Sorry. What is it?" Emily followed his gaze once again toward the elderly man near the window. Daniel hesitated. "I do not know." Yet that was not entirely true. He knew there was something important about Jerome. He simply could not understand why. Across the room, Jerome carefully closed the envelope and rested both hands on top of it. The golden light outside continued to fade as evening settled over the estate. The gardens beyond the glass windows were now painted in deep amber shadows. Inside, the wedding reception glowed warmly beneath hundreds of lights. Yet Jerome seemed untouched by either luxury or discomfort. He sat with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the moment he arrived. Charles Whitmore watched him from a distance. The longer Jerome remained, the more uncomfortable Charles became. Wolfe had taught Charles many things. One of them was that uncertainty made people nervous. And at that moment, Jerome Carter was uncertainty itself. No one knew why he was there. No one knew how he knew Daniel. No one knew what was inside the envelope. The unanswered questions irritated Charles. Finally, he motioned toward a member of the venue security team. The man approached immediately. Charles spoke quietly. "I want you to verify that guest belongs here." The guard nodded and started toward Jerome. Several nearby guests noticed and subtly turned their attention toward the developing situation. Jerome looked up as the guard arrived. "Good evening, sir," the man said politely. "May I see your invitation?" Jerome smiled faintly. "I am afraid I do not have a paper invitation." The guard remained professional. "Then perhaps your name is on the guest list." Jerome nodded. "Perhaps." The guard pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through hundreds of names. Seconds passed, then a minute. His expression slowly changed. He checked again, then a third time. Jerome simply waited. The guests watching from nearby tables exchanged curious glances. Finally, the guard looked up. "Sir, I cannot seem to find your name." A quiet ripple moved through the surrounding crowd. Jerome remained calm. "That does not surprise me." The answer puzzled the guard. "It does not." Jerome shook his head gently. "Daniel invited me himself. Many years ago." The guard frowned. "Many years ago?" Jerome's eyes drifted toward the groom. "Yes, a very long time ago." Nearby whispers immediately intensified. Some guests smirked. Others looked skeptical. To them, the explanation sounded impossible. Daniel Brooks was one of the most successful young executives in the state. Why would he personally invite an elderly stranger whose name appeared nowhere on the official guest list? Across the ballroom, Daniel watched every second of the exchange. Then something happened. As Jerome adjusted the envelope on his lap, a second item slipped partially into view. It was not another photograph. It was a folded letter. The paper was yellow with age, and written across the top, in unmistakable handwriting, was Daniel's own name. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken the moment he recognized the handwriting. From nearly 50 feet away, he should not have been able to identify it. The ballroom lights were dimmer now. Guests continued talking. Glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Yet somehow his eyes locked onto the faded lettering visible on the old folded paper resting inside Jerome's envelope. The world around him seemed to narrow. Emily noticed the sudden change immediately. "Daniel, what is wrong?" she asked. Daniel did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on Jerome. Memories began stirring at the edges of his mind. Old memories. The kind that remained buried for years until a single detail brought them rushing back. Across the ballroom, Jerome carefully slid the letter back into the envelope. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost protective. The paper clearly mattered to him. Nearby, the security guard shifted uncomfortably. He still stood beside Jerome's table, unsure how to proceed. Several guests were openly watching now. What had started as curiosity was becoming entertainment. One man chuckled quietly. No name on the guest list. Another guest shook her head. "I knew something was strange." The whispers spread quickly. Jerome heard them all. He simply chose not to respond. His calmness only made some people more uncomfortable. Charles Whitmore approached once again, this time with far less patience than before. His polished smile had disappeared completely. "Sir," Charles said firmly, "I think there has been some misunderstanding." Jerome looked up. "Has there? Your name is not on the guest list." Jerome nodded. "Apparently not. And yet you claim Daniel invited you personally." "He did." Several nearby guests exchanged skeptical looks. Charles exhaled slowly. "I do not wish to embarrass anyone tonight." Jerome's expression remained kind. "Neither do I." For a brief moment, Charles seemed caught off guard by the answer. There was no hostility, no argument, no attempt to defend himself, only quiet dignity. Still, Charles pressed forward. "Then perhaps it would be best if we resolve this privately." Jerome understood exactly what Charles meant. He was being asked to leave without anyone having to say the words directly. A few tables away, conversations softened as people waited to see what would happen next. Jerome glanced once toward Daniel. The groom was still watching. Their eyes nearly met before Jerome looked away. Then he slowly rose from his chair. The movement immediately attracted attention throughout the ballroom. Several guests assumed the situation was finally ending. Charles looked relieved. The security guard relaxed slightly. Jerome picked up the envelope and tucked it carefully beneath his arm. For a second, the old photograph slipped into view again. This time, Daniel saw enough to recognize a familiar face. His own, younger, wearing a military uniform. Daniel's breath caught. Suddenly, he remembered the letter. Suddenly, he remembered the photograph. And for the first time all evening, he remembered the man. Across the ballroom, his face went pale. Emily followed his stare. "Daniel?" she whispered. But Daniel was no longer listening. Because at that exact moment, Jerome turned toward the exit, preparing to walk away. Jerome took his first step toward the ballroom doors, and for a moment the entire evening seemed to settle into an uneasy silence. The laughter that had filled the room minutes earlier was gone. Conversations had softened into whispers. Even the music felt distant, almost muted beneath the weight of something no one could quite understand. Jerome kept his eyes forward. He had not come to create a scene. He had not come to prove anything. He had simply come because a promise made years ago still mattered to him. The envelope rested beneath his arm as he walked slowly across the polished floor. Reflections from the chandeliers shimmered across the marble beneath his shoes. Behind him, guests watched with quiet curiosity. Some looked satisfied, believing the awkward situation was finally ending. Others felt a strange discomfort they could not explain. There was something about the way Jerome carried himself. No anger, no embarrassment, no resentment, just dignity. Charles Whitmore released a small breath of relief. The problem appeared to be solving itself. He straightened his jacket and glanced towards several business associates nearby, hoping the moment would soon be forgotten. Yet something inside him remained unsettled. The old photograph, the letter, the look on Daniel's face. None of it made sense. Near the dance floor, Emily turned toward her fiancé. "Daniel?" she asked again. This time her voice carried genuine concern. Daniel did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on Jerome's retreating figure. Memories were no longer stirring now. They were returning in full. He remembered endless desert skies stretching across the horizon. He remembered long conversations beneath stars far from home. He remembered a steady voice offering guidance when uncertainty felt overwhelming. Most of all, he remembered a man who never asked for recognition. A man who led through quiet example instead of authority. Daniel's throat tightened. Across the ballroom, Jerome reached the edge of the room near the tall glass doors leading outside. Beyond the windows, evening had settled over the estate. Soft lights illuminated winding stone paths through the gardens. A fountain reflected silver beneath the darkening sky. Jerome paused for a moment and looked out at the peaceful scene. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. Older now, slower perhaps, but still carrying the same calm strength that had defined him decades earlier. He lowered his eyes toward the envelope. The corners were worn from years of handling. Inside rested memories, letters, and photographs that most people would never understand. For a brief moment, a faint smile crossed his face. He had seen Daniel. That was enough. Whether Daniel remembered him or not no longer mattered. Behind him, guests slowly began returning to their conversations. The tension appeared to be fading. Then a chair suddenly scraped across the ballroom floor. The sharp sound echoed through the room. Heads turned instantly. Daniel Brooks had risen to his feet. His expression had completely changed. The warmth of a groom enjoying his wedding day was gone. In its place was something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, shock. His eyes never left Jerome. Emily followed his gaze. Charles followed it too. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Daniel took a single step forward. And then another. Daniel's first step became a second. The second became a third. Then, without caring who was watching, he moved quickly across the ballroom. Guests turned in confusion as the groom abandoned the center of his own wedding reception. Conversations stopped one table at a time. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the musicians seemed uncertain as they watched Daniel cross the room with an urgency no one could explain. Jerome heard the movement behind him and slowly turned away from the glass doors. His expression remained calm, though a flicker of surprise touched his eyes when he saw Daniel approaching. For a moment, neither man spoke. The ballroom had become impossibly quiet. Daniel stopped a few feet away. His chest rose and fell heavily, not from exertion, but from emotion. Years had passed, more years than he wanted to admit. Yet the memories now stood before him as clearly as if no time had passed at all. Jerome offered a gentle smile. "Hello, Daniel." Hearing his own name spoken in that familiar voice was enough. Daniel felt the last pieces fall into place. The photograph, the letter, the invitation made long ago. Suddenly, he remembered an evening beneath a sunset sky. He remembered making a promise he had never expected to be tested by time. Most of all, he remembered the man who had shaped his understanding of integrity, responsibility, and character during one of the most important chapters of his life. Around them, guests exchanged bewildered looks. Charles Whitmore stood frozen several yards away. Emily watched silently, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Daniel looked down at the envelope beneath Jerome's arm. Then he looked back into the older man's eyes. "You came," he said quietly. Jerome's smile widened slightly. "You invited me." The simple answer landed with unexpected weight. Daniel lowered his gaze for a moment. "I was not sure. You would." "A promise matters," Jerome replied. "No matter how much time passes." Several guests glanced at one another. The room that had spent the evening questioning Jerome's presence now struggled to understand his importance. Daniel seemed to notice none of them. For him, the ballroom no longer existed. There was only gratitude. Gratitude for lessons received years ago. Gratitude for guidance that had continued shaping his life long after their paths separated. Slowly, Daniel reached toward the envelope. Jerome handed it to him without hesitation. Daniel carefully opened it. The old photograph rested on top. Beneath it sat the letter addressed in his own younger handwriting. The sight made his eyes shine. He remembered writing it. He remembered every word. He had sent it years ago and assumed it had long been forgotten. Yet Jerome had preserved it all this time. Daniel looked back at the older man. "You kept it." Jerome nodded. "Some things are worth keeping." Silence settled over the room once more. But this silence felt different. The judgment was gone. The mockery had disappeared. In its place stood anticipation. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something important. Then Daniel carefully closed the envelope, straightened his posture, and took one step backward from Jerome. The movement puzzled every guest in the ballroom. But Jerome immediately understood what Daniel was about to do. The moment Daniel stepped backward, a strange stillness settled across the ballroom. Jerome remained motionless, his calm expression unchanged, but everyone else seemed caught between confusion and anticipation. No one understood what the groom was doing. No one except Jerome. Daniel stood tall, his shoulders straightened. His eyes never left the older man standing before him. Then, in a movement so deliberate that every guest noticed it immediately, Daniel raised his right hand. A collective gasp moved through the room. The salute was flawless, precise, respectful, unmistakable. The ballroom froze. The musicians stopped playing. Servers stopped walking. Conversations vanished completely. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the scene unfolding near the entrance. Jerome looked at Daniel for several seconds before slowly returning the gesture. There was no pride in his face, no triumph, only quiet affection and mutual respect. Daniel lowered his hand first. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning toward the room, "I owe this man more than I can ever repay." No one moved. No one spoke. Charles Whitmore stared in disbelief. Emily covered her mouth softly with one hand. Daniel held up the old photograph. The image trembled slightly between his fingers. Many years ago, before my career, before my success, before I met Emily, I was a very different man. He glanced toward Jerome. There were moments when I doubted myself. Moments when I did not know what kind of person I wanted to become. His gaze returned to the crowd. Jerome Carter helped shape that answer. A murmur swept through the room. Daniel opened the envelope and carefully removed the yellowed letter. Time had faded the paper, but not the memories attached to it. I wrote this letter over 15 years ago, he said quietly. I told him that if I ever got married, I wanted him there. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Daniel smiled faintly. Most people make promises when they are young. Very few expect those promises to survive decades. He looked at Jerome again, but he remembered. The older man's eyes reflected the warm ballroom lights. Daniel unfolded the letter and read a few lines silently before lowering it. Emotion tightened his throat. I thanked him for teaching me something I have never forgotten. The room remained silent. He taught me that character matters when nobody is watching. He taught me that leadership is not about power. It is about service. Charles slowly lowered his eyes. The words seemed to land heavily inside him. Around the ballroom, guests who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable. The assumptions they had made only an hour before suddenly felt small. Daniel continued. Some of the greatest people I have ever known never appeared on magazine covers. They never chased recognition. They simply showed up every day and made other lives better. His gaze never left Jerome. That is who this man is. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Emily stepped forward. Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked at Jerome. She smiled warmly and extended her hand. Thank you for coming, she said softly. And for the first time that evening, the entire room began to understand just how wrong they had been. For several seconds after Emily welcomed him, no one in the ballroom seemed capable of speaking. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective. Guests who had spent the evening judging Jerome now found themselves studying him with entirely different eyes. The expensive suits, sparkling jewelry, and carefully curated appearances suddenly felt less important than the quiet man standing near the entrance holding a worn envelope. Charles Whitmore slowly stepped forward. The confidence that had defined him all evening was gone. He stopped in front of Jerome and lowered his gaze briefly before looking back up. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. The room listened carefully. Charles exhaled. I believed I understood who belonged here and who did not. I was wrong. Jerome's expression remained warm. There was no satisfaction in being proven right. No desire to embarrass anyone. He simply nodded. Thank you, Charles. The simple response seemed to surprise him. No lecture. No resentment. Just grace. Daniel watched the exchange and smiled softly. It was exactly what he expected from Jerome. Emily gently took Jerome's arm and guided him toward the center of the ballroom. You are not standing by the door anymore, she said. Tonight, you are family. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Chairs shifted. Guests made room. For the first time that evening, Jerome was not sitting alone. Dinner was served. Conversations slowly returned. But the tone had changed completely. People no longer whispered about him. They spoke with him. They listened to his stories. They asked questions. And Jerome answered each one with humility and kindness. Hours later, as the reception began winding down, the ballroom lights softened. Outside, the gardens glowed beneath rows of lanterns. Music drifted gently through the evening air. Daniel stepped outside for a moment and found Jerome standing near the fountain. The water reflected silver beneath the night sky. Neither man spoke immediately. They simply stood together, watching the fountain. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I almost forgot. Jerome smiled faintly. Life gets busy. Daniel looked down. Still, I should have found you sooner. Jerome placed a hand on his shoulder. You remembered when it mattered. The younger man's eyes grew emotional. Everything good in my life traces back to lessons you taught me. Jerome shook his head. No, those choices were yours. I only pointed toward the path. A breeze moved through the gardens, carrying the scent of roses across the estate. For a moment, both men stood quietly beneath the stars. Then Daniel glanced toward the ballroom, where Emily waited inside. Laughter floated through the open doors. Family and friends filled the room with warmth. The life he had built stretched out before him. Jerome followed his gaze and smiled. Looks like you have somewhere you need to be. Daniel laughed softly. Yes, sir. He hesitated before adding, "Thank you. For everything." Jerome nodded. Daniel returned to the reception. A few moments later, Jerome remained alone beside the fountain. He reached into the envelope one final time and looked at the old photograph. The corners were worn. The colors had faded. Yet the memory remained bright. Slowly, he slid the photograph back inside and closed the envelope. Through the ballroom windows, he could see Daniel and Emily sharing a dance beneath the chandeliers. The promise had been kept. The circle was complete. Jerome smiled, turned toward the garden path, and walked into the soft glow of the evening lights while laughter, music, and the quiet satisfaction of a life that had truly mattered followed behind him.